In this lesson, we're going to be building off of the problem that we set up at the end of the previous lesson, which if you need to go back and rewatch that for a refresher, please do. But in short, here was the problem. We can upload an image in our application, but unless we actually save this to a particular data type, like let's say a diary entry, so we'll save our image to a diary entry. If we don't do that, then this image is just useless, basically. It's what we might call orphaned. It's not attached to any data type, so it's just sort of lost in this huge warehouse of files in our file storage. Nobody knows what it's attached to, what it's for. It's the equivalent of trying to post a letter without an address on it. It ends up in the mailroom and nobody knows where it's meant to go or where it's come from. So what we need to do instead is to attach it to a particular diary entry. This is also going to set us up really well for later on in the course, where we're going to set up restrictions that are going to mean that only those users who have created a particular diary entry can view the images for that diary entry. So we'll get into Bubble in just a minute, but let me just sketch out here what we're going to do. We've got our create and edit diary entry view here. And it's from this view that we are allowing a user to choose an image from their camera or their photo library. What we also need to have within this view is some kind of diary entry shaped container, which we can use to hold on to a diary entry, so that whenever we upload an image, we can immediately attach that image to the corresponding diary entry. Now this compartment here, you may be able to guess that this is going to be a view property. And for us to have a diary entry ready to put into this view property, we actually need to create it over here, so to speak. We need to create it before we pass it into this view. And so that's going to mean that our first step is going to be to create a diary entry. That's going to be our first step. And we're going to pass that diary entry into our create/edit diary entry view. That means that whenever the user chooses an image, we can immediately attach that to the corresponding diary entry. And at this stage, we could more or less treat this diary entry as a draft diary entry, right? And as a draft, what we may want to do is allow the user to hit cancel, which is going to delete the draft diary entry. Now, we don't strictly have to do this step, but it does just help not clog up our user's interface with a bunch of diary entries that they started to create and then didn't finish. But we'll discuss the pros and cons of doing this. And then the other action that we're going to allow the user to take is to save a diary entry. And what we're basically going to do there is we're going to use our make changes action to, of course, the diary entry. And in that action, in that make changes action, is where we're going to do things like save the title field, save the start date for the diary entry, and also, incidentally, change the diary entry from a draft diary entry to a non-draft diary entry. So this is what we're doing conceptually. The first thing that I want us to do to actually set this up in practice is to set up this view property. Now on our diary create edit view, we actually already have a view property for a diary entry here. So that's very helpful. The one thing that I'm going to change though is that I'm going to make this a required field. I'm not going to set it to be optional. And that's of course because, as we just discussed, we're now going to always create a diary entry before we show this create edit view, so that we can push a draft diary entry into this view property to attach an image to. So there's no scenario now in which this view property can be empty. Otherwise, our create logic will break. So that's why I'm going to leave optional here unticked. Now, as soon as I do that, I'm going to get an issue. And if I click on this, it's going to take me to a place where we were showing this diary entry view, but not passing in a diary entry. So that was where previously we were hitting create diary entry. So now what we're talking about is when this button is clicked, we actually need to create a draft diary entry already at this stage to pass into this field. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a new diary entry already at this point when we are clicking create diary entry from the trip details view. So I'm going to choose here diary entry, and we don't need to set any of the fields here. There's just one field that we probably should have now on our diary entry, which we do not. If I go into my data tab, we can set this up. And that field is going to be a draft field. Is this diary entry a draft or not? And we can actually use here a field type called a yes or a no field. So as you would imagine, the value of that field will either be yes or it will be no. Those are the only two options for this field. And what we can do over here within the data tab section is we can actually choose for all new diary entries, what should the default value of this field be? So I could say here that the default value will be yes. This now means that any time that we create a new diary entry, like in this workflow action right here, that the draft field here will be set to yes. And I can prove this to you in the web preview here. If I go and create a new diary entry, and then I go and look in the app data tab, you'll see that we've got a new diary entry here with the draft field set to yes. And so now that when this button create diary entry is clicked, we're creating a draft diary entry, we can do the equivalent of passing that diary entry into this diary entry view property for our create and edit view. So to do that, we just open up the action where we are opening this create edit diary entry view, and we can choose as the data source for the view property. In other words, what diary entry are we populating this view property with? We can choose there the result of step one, in other words, the diary entry that we just created in this workflow. So that's this step of the equation. We're passing in a draft diary entry. Now let's add the logic that attaches any uploaded image to that draft diary entry. So to do that, let's go into our diary entry, create and edit view, and let's take a look at our actions here that we set up in the previous lesson. We had set this up more or less for demonstration purposes so that we were saving the image that the user uploaded, the image that they took with their camera in this case, to a custom state. But we can remove this now that we have this draft diary entry on the view. The draft diary entry, because it has this image field on it, that gives us a place where we can store the uploaded image, the image from the user's camera. We don't need this intermediary custom state anymore. So I'm going to hit these three dots and I'm going to delete it. And I'm actually going to instead have a guess at what we might do here. We're going to make changes. Yes, we're going to make changes to the draft diary entry. Where does the draft diary entry live? Of course, it lives here within the view property diary entry. So that is what we're going to change. So I'm going to choose here that view property living on the view. So let's grab that diary entry. And then what are we going to change? Well, we are going to set the value of the image field on that draft diary entry to the result of step one, the image that the user has just chosen with their camera. And if I go and test this out now, what we should find in our app data tab is a new diary entry with that image that I just took from my phone. And we should do exactly the same thing when the user chooses an image from their camera library rather than directly from their camera. So I'll delete that old action where we're setting the image value into the custom state and instead make changes to the diary entry living inside of that view property. And of course, we'll set the image value again to be the result of the previous step. And now that we've done this, we can do something a little interesting, which is that inside of our group here, we can actually display the uploaded image. So I'm going to do that by actually setting the the background style of this group to be an image, and I'm going to set the data source here to be a dynamic image. Where is that image coming from? Well, we're going to either take a photo with the user's camera or upload it from their photo library. In either case, we're going to save that image into this image field living on the diary entry living inside of the diary entry view property. So it makes sense that we can just pull the image from that same image field on the diary entry. So we'll look inside of that diary entry, inside of the view property, and pull out the image field. When we do this, we actually get a few options for how we want this image to appear. I actually do want it to crop itself so it fits within this group, but I also want to center it. And let's test this out now. If I choose from my library this time, and I choose an image from my photo library, it may take a moment, but there it is. There is the image that I just uploaded. Now, we could do some UX fine-tuning, like hiding these buttons whenever the image is uploaded. So to do that, I can simply hide this group with the buttons by default, and then add some condition under which these buttons will be visible. And what do you think that condition would be? Well, we want to show the buttons whenever the user has no image already attached to the diary entry, right? In other words, whenever that diary entry, living inside of that view property, as always, whenever that diary entry's image field is empty, right? Is empty. In that scenario, let's show the buttons. So if I take a picture here, it'll take a moment for this image to be uploaded. And once it is, you can see that it now takes up this entire input, which is great. Now, one thing you may notice is that if I close this modal, why is my draft diary entry not appearing here? We can see that they exist within the database. They're just not appearing on the list of diary entries on our trip view. So whenever you encounter a scenario like this, the right place to start is just inspecting what is the data source for this list. So we'll go to our trip details view, and let's click on here our vertical list of diary entries. And it looks like we're searching for all of the diary entries where the trip is equal to the trip that we're actually viewing the details for. Well, this gives us a clue, right? Because all of the diary entries that we just created as drafts have an empty trip field. So the reason that they're not appearing is because when we create these diary entries upon this button being clicked here, we're creating a new diary entry, but we're not setting the trip field. So that's one step that we forgot to do. We need to, when we create the diary entry, we need to set the trip field to be equal to the trip within this trip details view. So that is going to be inside of the trip details view, we have this trip property that we can choose. And if I now try to create a new draft and upload an image, and let's just say for the sake of argument that I hit cancel here, you can't actually see it that easily, ironically, but it's right here. There's actually a diary entry, an empty diary entry right there. If I click on it, well, this is the current diary entry details view. I can actually click on the three-dot menu as we've set things up and go and edit this, and you can see that it is indeed that same diary entry with the same image. Okay, so now we've got a little bit of user experience finessing to do. On the one hand, if the user hits this cancel button and hasn't changed any of the values and any of the inputs, well, then maybe we should just delete that diary entry, right? We should just assume that they don't want it. And on the other hand, this save changes button should probably just say create when the user has literally just clicked the create diary entry button. Probably shouldn't say save changes up here. So let's deal with the latter update first. So I'm here inside of the diary entry, create and edit view again. We've got this save button, which currently we've got this conditional formatting, which is saying that, hey, if the diary entry that we've passed into this view is empty, right? You haven't passed a diary entry into this view, then we can assume that we're in create mode and we're going to show the text create. Otherwise, we're going to say save changes. But we've changed our logic here a little bit now, right? Because we are now always passing in a diary entry into this create edit view. There's no scenario in which this diary entry property can be empty. So that means that the foundation of this conditional expression needs to change. It shouldn't be is empty. What should it be? Well, it should be is the diary entry a draft or not? When we first show this diary entry view, the diary entry is a draft, right? We set the default value for that field to be yes, right? This is actually the whole reason why we set up this draft field in the first place. In a moment, we're going to look at the logic for changing this from yes to no, but for now, we can use the fact that a diary entry starts as a draft as an anchor for this condition. So instead of looking at whether the diary entry is empty or not, we just look at whether it's a draft. And as it turns out, you see here that the expression just reads draft. What this actually means here is draft is yes. If I was actually to get rid of this formatted as text and hit more, you can see that the condition that I can choose from here is that draft field yes or is it no? And off the back of one of those, I can add my formatted as text. But as it turns out, is draft is yes is exactly the same thing as simply draft. So you can just leave out that last part of the expression, unless of course that last part of the expression that you're evaluating is whether it's no. In our case, I'm just going to undo a few times. So we go back to how things were, where it's just diary entries draft, which as we just learned means diary entries draft is yes, because I still have preserved here my conditional formatting. By the way, where it says here Boolean formatting, a Boolean value is a value that can either be yes or no, right? So that's the equivalent of our yes, no field. The yes, no field in Bubble is the equivalent to a Boolean type field in other programming languages. So you might hear these two terms used interchangeably. So let's have a look here. I'm going to create a new diary entry and voila, you see here that this button is now saying create. But we should now add some logic to change a diary entry from a draft to not a draft once they add some values and hit create. So let's take a look at the workflow that happens when the user hits the save button. One of the things that we're doing is creating a new diary entry. So this is a remnant from how we had things set up in this view previously. So I can actually remove this altogether. Now, we're always going to have a diary entry inside of this view, right? We're always going to be either making changes to a draft diary entry or to a non-draft diary entry. And so this action here is kind of all we need. I don't even need, if I right click on this only when condition, I don't even need that condition anymore. The only thing that I need to add to here is setting that draft field to be no. As it turns out, I don't even need this image field actually, because whenever we are either taking a photo with the camera or choosing from the user's camera library, at that point, we're actually saving the image into that diary entries image field. So I can actually remove this field altogether. But back to the matter at hand, we're setting the diary entry draft value to no whenever this button is clicked. So let's take a look at this now. I'm going to add a photo, add some test info here. I'm going to hit create. There's my entry there. If I now click on this, and now I try to go in and edit, which if we remind ourselves, on our diary entry details view, that's this view here, whenever that edit button is clicked, what we're doing is we are going to the diary entry create and edit view, and we're passing in a diary entry. The diary entry that we're passing in now is not a draft, and so therefore I see save changes instead of create. So this is working fairly well. There's just one problem, and that is if I hit here create diary entry and then I hit cancel, I'm just ending up with all of these empty values. If I add another one, you might see this more clearly. Right now there's another one down the bottom, another one, right? I'm just creating all of these just empty values here that are just clogging up this trip details view and just don't make for a super nice user experience. So probably the easiest way to solve this is if the user hits create diary entry and then hits cancel, is we just delete the draft diary entry that we just created, right? No harm, no foul, no problem. We just have to make sure that if we are editing a diary entry, that when the user hits cancel from this context, when they're editing a diary entry, that we're not accidentally deleting their diary entry. So if we go into our diary entry logic here, what kind of logic do you think that we would use for this? Where in one scenario, the user's just creating the diary entry for the first time, we want them to hit cancel and that delete the draft diary entry. And in the other scenario, they've gone to edit the diary entry and we want cancel to just hide the view. So what we've got here are two scenarios, two conditions, right? Two different things can happen from one button click. So going to the previous mobile view, that's going to happen regardless of whether the user is just creating the first diary entry or whether they're editing, right? If they hit create diary entry here and then hit cancel, we're still going to hide the view. Just the same as if we go to edit a diary entry and hit cancel, we're also going to hide the create edit view. So this action is probably safe, but there's one action that we want to come before this, which is to delete that draft diary entry, right? So we're going to use data, delete thing, same action that we've seen earlier on when we added the ability to delete a trip or delete a diary entry. And the thing that we're going to delete is, of course, the diary entry that we're storing in this diary entry property. But we don't want this to happen every single time, do we? Because right now, if I create a new diary entry and I hit cancel, okay, good, it's not appearing down here. But if I try to edit an existing diary entry, like Caldy Island here, if I now hit cancel, that just deleted my Caldy Island diary entry. So that's not very good. That's not what we want. So on this action, we obviously need to add some kind of condition, right? And that condition, have a little guess. What's it gonna be? It's gonna be, of course, is that diary entry that we are holding in this diary entry, create and edit view right now, is that diary entry a draft? If it is a draft, right, if draft is yes, which as we learned is exactly the same thing as simply draft. If it is a draft, then let's delete it. Otherwise, let's just hide the view. And so now if I go to edit one of my existing diary entries and I hit cancel, that diary entry is not deleted. Now, there is one thing to note in the way that we've got things set up, which is that if I create a draft and I add an image and then I hit cancel, what we've just done is we've deleted the diary entry. But what about the image? Is the image still somewhere in our file storage, or is that deleted now too? Have a little think about that. Well, remember what I said about the image being stored in our file storage, but the image field that we might store on a data type, like our diary entry, is just simply a link, a relationship, or a reference, as we might call it, to the location of the image file in our file storage. In other words, when we view a diary entry with an image, the image is just living at some web address like this. This is what we learned in the previous lesson. And what that means is that even if our latest diary entry was just deleted from our database, if we look inside of the file manager, you'll actually see that the image still exists in our file storage. And now we have sort of the original problem, which is that we have an image that's not attached to any data type. So it's just orphaned, it's just floating around empty, not attached to anything, clogging up our file storage. And the way around that is that before we delete the diary entry, we actually delete the image file. And we do that using an action under data, and it is called delete an uploaded file. And for this, we just simply add in the URL, the web address for this file. And we can just simply pass in here that image field from our diary entry. So the image field here, which will equate to the web address for the image. And of course, we should add this same condition to the delete an uploaded file action. So what I can also do is just right click on this expression, copy it, and then inside this conditional part of the delete an uploaded file action, I just right click, paste expression. And what that now means is that if I create a new diary entry, take a photo, and then hit cancel, that the image that I just took with my camera is not here in my file storage. Now, one thing that is worth noting is that if I create a new draft diary entry, and instead of hitting cancel, I actually just swipe down from the top of this modal, that I will actually have a empty diary entry. And that's because swiping here is not triggering this workflow to delete an uploaded file and delete the diary entry. And unfortunately, there's no easy workaround for this right now in the mobile beta. So what I would suggest that you do is for any draft diary entries that don't end up getting deleted, is you just give them a label here that just says that they're a draft. And so on our trip details view where we are showing the diary entries, including the draft ones, is what we can do is we can just add a little condition that says if the title field is empty, which we're kind of using as a proxy or as a signal that this diary entry is a draft, is we can add a little operator at the end of it here, if I hit more, which is called defaulting to. And that basically means, hey, if this preceding part of the expression is empty, I want you to default to or display instead this other value. And that other value we could just say is draft. And so what that means is that our draft diary entries are going to appear for our users, which then just gives them the choice. Do I want to go back into that diary entry and edit it and maybe add some values? Or do I just want to delete it? And you can see here where we delete it and it's got an empty title, we should probably also put in that defaulting to text. So that lives on the diary entry details view where we've got this delete confirmation. We can add again here this defaulting to, we can just say this draft diary entry will be permanently deleted. And so if I click on this draft here and now give the user the choice to delete it, you see that the text is updated and they can of course then delete the drafts that somehow fall through the cracks, so to speak. Okay, so well done for sticking with me through this lesson and the last lesson. I know that this draft diary entry architecture is not necessarily the most intuitive thing that we've set up in the course so far, but it is going to set us up in really good stead for the rest of what we build here, and it is likely going to be a pattern that you're going to need to implement yourself in your own application. Before we move on to location services, you may have noticed that when you're uploading an image, there's a little bit of a delay. And so what we're going to do in the next lesson is we're going to set up a loading indicator while the image is being uploaded. So I'll see you in the next lesson.